animal, animal-based agriculture to plant-based foods, despite mounting scientific agreement that such a shift is critical for planetary and public health. What tactics are they using to achieve this goal?
Thank you, Karen, for the wonderful introduction and for the question. So what I find really interesting is that the fossil fuel industry actively had messaging and campaigns that were encouraging consumers to use less energy. These are ongoing. I was just in London. I saw an Esso ad encouraging carpooling. And in contrast to that, the animal agriculture industry opposes any work that advocates for eating less meat. We have a project that is tracking their response to campaigns to reduce meat since the 1980s, at least here in the United States. And it's clear they have, again, this kind of suite of tactics that they deploy that include things like press releases, advertorials, advertisements taken out in major newspapers, full counter campaigns that take a variety of tactics, including attacking authors or taking out airtime on radio stations, lobbying against policies that would commit, for instance, to a policy like Meatless Mondays, and then hiring scientists to say very similar things that the industry would like to say, but they would like a neutral, credible third-party voice to do so. And that's our latest paper that we have out. Some of the work of these two professors and two centers at two major US universities are specifically aimed at policies designed to attack policies that would reduce meat consumption. Again, mostly in the United States, but not exclusively. And the result of all of this, as far as I can tell, has been to greatly reduce the ambition of civil society efforts. So in the late 1980s, you see a major campaign launched to reduce beef consumption by 50%. And nowadays, or especially at least, 15 years ago, we started talking more comprehensively about Meatless Mondays. So from 50% reduction to 1 day a week. And now, if you're following at all this thing called the plant-based treaty, what you're really seeing are cities committing to procuring more plants in their in the diets that they provide for the city, and including in schools.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're just a little over time, so if that's okay, we'll move on to asking anybody for any of the other panelists who want to add something. No one? Okay, let's move on to another question. Jason, as editor of the book, Meatsplaining, could you describe what meatsplaining is and how the animal agriculture industry uses language paired with imagery to greenwash its practices?
Sure. So meatsplaining, as you can probably guess, is a term that riffs on Rebecca Solnit's concept of mansplaining, which she introduced in her book, Men Explain Things to Me. And so meatsplaining I describe as a kind of arrogant form of meat industry lecturing of animal ag critics. And so what I say in my book is that it functions as a silencing mechanism for shutting down criticism, similar to what Jennifer was just describing, where the industry frames critics as extremist or childish or ignorant. It sets boundaries between who is rational and credible and who is irrational and completely lacking in credibility, and kind of trying to control the public discourse about the meat industry. And so I identify three distinct threats to the industry: the ethical critique, the biomedical critique, and then the ecological critique. And so each one of these has their own form of devoted meatsplaining. So one example is the policing of language. They're doing this in Europe, where you're not allowed to say terms like meat or burger or milk or cheese for plant-based products. You have to say veggie discs or cashew drink or something like that. Premised on the idea that people won't know what they're eating unless you label it as such. And then another way is by demonizing plant-based products, right? Putting a picture of a plant-based burger and then a beef burger and then listing the ingredients for one and then the one ingredient for the other beef. And the idea is that the plant-based burger has all of these, ingredients, and therefore it's unnatural, it's terrible. And this other one has one ingredient, beef, and so therefore it's fine. Or they'll do the same thing with dairy, right? So these are just attempts to present beef and milk and dairy and so forth as healthier, and it's educating an audience of what they take to be idiots about food.
Thank you, Jennifer. I mean, sorry, God. Thank you, Jason. And my apologies, Jennifer. I didn't give you enough time. So if you wanted to just add anything, we can do so in your next question. So I'd like to move on to Tushar. What tactics are used by the industry and its supporters to obscure or confuse the research about the health impacts of animal product consumption?
Yeah, so I'd like to say that thank you. And we see disinformation coming from multiple large industries. I don't want to portray this as something exclusive to the animal agriculture industry, but the animal agriculture industry is particularly particularly sophisticated in creating disinformation, both on health parameters as well as environmental parameters and other things too. Regarding health, one of the most insidious things that the industry does, because it causes disinformation on multiple levels, right? It's kind of vertically integrated in terms of its disinformation. But when it comes to health studies, there are a lot of studies that are funded originally by animal agriculture itself. And if you look at in the older times, you go back 20 years, in many cases, they would always disclose their funding, that this came, you look at the fine print, it's from the Egg Marketing Board or something like that. But if you go, like, years closer and closer to now, you will see more and often it says no, no funding conflicts to, disclose. Okay, it always says that, but it's more and more suspect because they're coming out a lot of big papers that probably do take a lot of funding to create. And when it comes to those studies, you see repeated patterns within the studies that the methodology of the study will lead to an outcome where either the animal product looks benign, no better, no worse, or somewhat better, and so forth. And I'm not sure if there's much time, but some tactics like that, for example, in health studies, you often compare two groups, a group eating, let's say, one way, and maybe more plant-based or less eggs or something like that, to another group that's eating more eggs or more animal products or something like that. You're comparing the two groups, and you can set up the groups in such a way that you won't find much of a difference. For example, let's take an example. People may look at carbohydrates and say that, hey, carbohydrates, it turns out carbohydrate type foods or grain-based foods really are bad for you. And so they'll do a study and show this. But what they won't really show in the study is that they're comparing people who are eating mostly refined carbohydrates like white rice, white bread, and those kind of things, to people who are eating, let's say, animal products, but not distinguishing those people who consume whole grain products compared to the animal products, because whole grains are found to be beneficial, relatively speaking, and refined carbohydrates are not beneficial. And therefore, you can obscure the benefit of one or the detriment of the other by conflating these groups, and you design that right into the methodology. Now, the average reader is not going to distinguish that. Even people who are sort of scientifically literate may not really know those things. And they do those kind of tactics in typical methodology tactics when it comes to looking at cholesterol, looking at different cholesterol parameters, making very small differences between the groups, or taking a group of people eating plant-based foods that is very high in saturated fat compared to animal food consumption that is similar, rather than taking an optimal plant-based diet or something like this. And the list goes on. One of the things that Jason mentioned is making ingredient lists look bad. And that is part of something that's advocated, is the NOVA classification of processed foods, which is this way of classifying processed foods that lumps them all together, but doesn't distinguish them on an individual basis, where some processed foods may overall be quite beneficial, even though they are processed in many ways, and especially things like transition foods like plant-based meats. And again, within the plant-based meat category, there are some that are high in saturated fat, high in sodium, others that are very low and very probably really good. And we should be distinguishing these on an individual basis rather than lumping them in with everything from soda pop and Twinkies and all these things, and sort of labeling them all as bad categorically. So these are a few of the tactics you see repeating themselves, and there are more, but I think probably my time is up right now.
Thank you, Tushar. Kenny, despite a long history of the industry using disinformation tactics, the media and the public are ill-equipped to deal with disinformation. How can consumers distinguish between accurate and misleading information regarding animal agriculture, particularly when there's a conflicting data from various sources?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's tough because, for one, agricultural science is really complex, and it takes a lot of time to gain even basic literacy on this issue, which most people don't have the time to wade through agricultural journals to better understand how food impacts the environment, and not just climate change, but also water pollution or air quality or the effects of land use in agriculture, which are enormous forces that are shaping the planet, but again, are pretty complex. And I feel like even though I read these articles every day, I still have so many questions and I'm still learning so much. So, and then I think secondly, journalism has really underinvested in this issue. So even many of the nations, and I'm speaking for the US here, but I'm sure it's similar in Canada and in other parts of the world. Even leading, national news outlets don't have people focused on agriculture, or if they do, it's maybe more market focused. It's not so much looking at the issues that we're talking about on this panel. So I think with all that said, with consumers, I think, they should look at claims made by companies with a lot of skepticism. And again, I think Tushar said this isn't exclusive to animal agriculture. This is, applies to pretty much any company. You want to do your homework and try to better understand what their claims mean. But when it comes to food choices, generally speaking, plant-based is always going to be better for the environment, whether it's whether you're looking at it just on greenhouse gas emissions, but also air pollution, water pollution, land use, when compared to animal-based diets or diets that are heavy in animal products. So I think again, it's important for consumers to be skeptical about claims, at least in the United States. Companies have a lot of leeway given to them by the U.S. Department of Agriculture on what they can say on their food packaging, and that also carries over to their advertising. You see a lot of vague claims like sustainable, net zero, carbon neutral, which can sound impressive to consumers, but aren't so simple or clear cut when you actually look into them. So to the average consumer, I would say, have a healthy dose of skepticism, try to learn more about this issue. And generally speaking, plant-based is going to be better for the environment on several metrics than animal-based.
Thank you, Kenny. Okay, we're going to go on to round two. Now, first of all, I want to just ask Jennifer, again, I apologize for the interruption. So I'd like you to finish up what you were saying about the tactics that the animal agriculture is using to disinform the public. And then we'll move on to your second question.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I really was almost done. I think the tactics I outlined pretty clearly, and the main thing that I'm seeing or concerned about is that the reduction in ambition from civil society groups in response to the tactics that says, let's cut beef by 50%. No, let's do 1 day a week meatless, to let's eat more plants. And that's a very different kind of message than actually reducing meat consumption.
Thank you. very much. Okay, so second question. In your amazing study, The Climate Responsibilities of Industrial Meat and Dairy Producers, you suggest that meat and dairy giants like JBS, Tyson, Nestle's, and Cargill obscure their emissions. Could you explain how they do this and how doing so impedes nations' abilities to meet their Paris Agreement commitments?
Yeah, thank you. The problem with working on this topic, disinformation or what companies are doing, is that everything is changing so swiftly right now. And so some of that information is outdated, but some is actually more relevant than ever. And you point out a case right in your introduction about Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, bringing a lawsuit against JBS for its claims about net zero. So in the 2019 sustainability report that we examined for that paper, and we examined 35 of the largest meat and dairy companies globally, JBS says explicitly, we will take no responsibility for our indirect emissions, or what we would call scope 3 emissions. Fast forward to 2021, our paper is coming out, and we see this full page ad in the New York Times about JBS committing to net zero by 2040 and net zero across all 3 scope of emissions. So it's like, wait, they went from not taking explicitly no responsibility to now committing to net zero. And that should tell you something about the internal capacity to even address those concerns, because I think that they, and part of the lawsuit rests on the lack of internal metrics for even measuring or gauging what net zero would mean for a company like JBS. But then I think, so that's one way, is that companies can say, we're not taking responsibility for our scope 3 emissions. Again, this is a question of how we view responsibility generally. But then there's this question about, does it impede commitments made nationally for Paris? And one of the things that we find in the paper, and that seems to continue to be true, is that by and large, most countries are ignoring their animal agriculture emissions generally. And sometimes that appears to be an issue of convenience, and other times it seems more strategic. That the companies are in fact working with governments, split leaf carve-outs, in the case of New Zealand. And basically, if countries do not get a better grasp on animal agriculture emissions, do not start holding companies that are headquartered there or producing meat there responsible for those emissions, and starting to be genuinely concerned about methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas in the short run, we really are going to be, we're going to miss a major opportunity to address warming in this crisis moment.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Canada is right up there with working with the meat industry, working with government to not do enough with our emissions. So I want to move on to Jason. Jason, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization forecasts a continued rise in global meat production in the next decade, driven by increasing incomes in the global south. However, this trajectory conflicts with the climate goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. To address this challenge, the industry is reframing the narrative, portraying meat as a solution to climate change. What are some of the ways they're doing this?
Sure. So the main way, and I think probably everybody here has some sort of familiarity with this, is by pushing the idea of regenerative agriculture and regenerative beef and so forth. And so the idea is that you can use livestock grazing for restoring the environment. You can use it to reverse desertification. And then the kind of more sort of outrageous and audacious claim is that you can use livestock grazing to reverse climate change. So the core idea here is this idea of regeneration. And that was injected into the public lexicon by the Rodale Institute in the 80s and 90s. And this was never intended to be a scientific concept. This was intended to be a philosophical and lifestyle concept. So Robert Rodale published papers about regenerative thinking and regenerative diets and regenerative lifestyles and regenerative medicine, and then eventually regenerative agriculture. And this concept of regeneration has a biblical origin, the Greek term palingenesis. By accepting Christ, you'll save your soul and you'll undergo a spiritual rebirth. And that basic theme is very much at work in the idea of regenerative agriculture. It's a secularized version. By practicing or supporting regenerative ag and by buying grass-fed beef, you'll save the planet. It's a doctrine of ecological salvation. So regeneration is very much the new pink ribbons, the campaign to fight breast cancer. And the pink ribbons campaign was identified back in the 90s and 2000s as a dream cause. And now regeneration has been identified as the new dream cause. So many companies have seized on this idea to rebrand themselves as regenerative. Cargill and General Mills and McDonald's and Burger King and Walmart is claiming that by 20 something it will be a regenerative company, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, right? But so it's basically it's corporate social responsibility as a way of greenwashing their companies.
Thank you. Kenny, in July, the CBC aired an episode on The Current titled Making Meat More Sustainable, exploring the findings of the Oxford University study that suggests that a slight reduction in meat consumption by heavy meat eaters could have a significant environmental impact, akin to removing 8 million cars from the road. However, the two guests interviewed, both industry representatives, were focused primarily on portraying Canada's beef as already sustainable. Meanwhile, the host appeared unprepared to challenge their unsubstantiated claims regarding sustainability. What role does the media play in ensuring the accuracy of the information they present? And how can we address the influence of sensationalized or biased narratives perpetuated by media echo chambers? And are there existing examples of efforts to counteract this phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think the media plays a huge role in this. So just as kind of a table setting point, there was a survey done by an environmental research organization called Madre Brava, in which they asked people in numerous countries how they rank certain polluting industries. And by and large, people around the world ranked industrial meat production as one of the lowest, even though it was actually one of the highest relative to the other industries. So consumers are already kind of going into the grocery store and into restaurants with very little understanding of how food consumption or food production affects the environment. And so I think it's the role of journalists to kind of play translator to what we might read in agricultural or climate science journalists and making that understandable for the average person, again, who doesn't have the time to dig into these issues. And so I think, when journalists work on this issue, again, like I mentioned earlier, I think they should just be skeptical of claims made by industry, by the animal agriculture industry, just as they would of any other industry. And I also think news outlets should hire more agricultural journalists. I know I'm repeating myself a bit again here, but I think these are some of the main issues. I think journalists, like the average person, maybe have their biases or gaps in knowledge, where the average person might see a cow grazing on pasture or a pig in a farm and think, that's natural. They wouldn't kind of equate it to smokestacks coming from coal plants. We often don't see farming as a source of pollution. And so I think news organizations could do a great job here by just hiring more specialists to study and report on this issue. And then to ensure a balanced mix of people that they're interviewing, not just industry representatives and also not just activists, but also scientists who study this issue, like Jennifer. And then I'll just, as in my last point, I'll say that there are a lot of good sources working on this issue. Not enough, but there are a handful. not to toot my own horn, but I'll say Vox, as we've long been working on this issue, and I'm one of just several journalists who write about this issue. But also The Guardian. The Guardian does fantastic work reporting on this issue globally, with a focus on Europe, but also US and around the world. Other sources I'll mention is DeSmog, Civil Eats, Grist, Inside Climate News. There's a reporter named Georgina Gustin at Inside Climate News who does really good reporting on this issue. There's many freelancers who work on this issue, and then of course, check out the work of fellow panelists.
Thank you, Kenny. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is go to a question for all the panelists. What are some solutions to disinformation in animal agriculture, and how can we implement them? Let's start with Jennifer, and then we'll just go around Jason, Tushar, and then Kenny. Thank you.
Well, again, just a reference to that I brought up, the lawsuit from the Attorney General against JBS is the first lawsuit against greenwashing for animal ag related to climate change. We expect to see a number of additional cases brought forward eventually, and litigation will obviously be part of the resistance to disinformation. More recently, as was mentioned in my introduction, this paper about the way animal ag has infiltrated vis-a-vis climate change, US universities, and I'm sure other universities. We've seen that happen in Canada, in the UK, and other places. And the real question is how to make that more ethical or less insidious. And we call on these universities really, and we have not seen strong responses as yet, but these universities to be held accountable, to not allow industry to stay in the background, to not allow university researchers to be basically PR for the industry without disclosing or making very clear their industry funding. And that's a kind of broad issue across disinformation generally, is that you have university experts who are trusted by the public masquerading as independent when in fact they sit on huge slush funds from industry groups. And even if they were just more transparent about that, I feel like it would help in general the issue of disinformation.
Thank you. Okay, so anyone else? Kenny, Tushar, do you want to answer this question? And I just want to say I missed Tushar's second question. My apologies. So we will go back to his question at the end of this question about solutions.
I just want to mention in terms of what Jennifer was saying about non-transparency about funding, and a couple of things. One is that hopefully disinformation, I view disinformation as one of the greatest global problems in and of itself, as big as climate change or global conflict or anything like that, because all of the major problems on Earth depend on disinformation in order to continue doing what they're doing. And it's very deep and very complex, and people put millions and billions of dollars of funding into committing to disinformation because it's part of their marketing budget. It's not a conspiracy, it's part of their marketing budget, and it's part of how you do business now in a world where business dominates. And when it comes to transparency and funding, I think it's a bigger and bigger, more difficult issue. My dad was a tax auditor before he retired. And there are so many ways in which people can really sophisticated manners in which they can hide their taxable income. In comparison, it's going to be a piece of cake to hide who you're funded by if you're just an academic or whatever, and just you get paid by somebody, but you don't have to. Nobody can dig into your bank account and see where every penny from your account comes from, and that's going to be a really big issue on the academic side when it comes to people who are funded and saying that they have no conflicts of interest, yet publishing repeatedly big things that have methodological flaws that you can see repeating themselves.
Thank you, Tushar. Kenny?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. So I think, I've maybe a broken record here, but more and stronger journalism on this issue. But I'd also add that stricter, regulations for governmental agencies on what companies can and cannot say on their packaging and in their advertising. I mean, speaking to what Tushar just said, there is a line from Jennifer's recent report on this issue that really stuck out to me, in which correct me if I'm wrong here, Jennifer, but I think someone from a large meat company basically said that some of the reports that academics were creating like a license for meat companies to continue to operate. So these industries really do rely on disinformation to evade regulation and public scrutiny. And I'd also add here, this might be a bit controversial, but I'd add that leading environmental.
Kenny, are you there?
I think he might be frozen.
Yeah. We'll just wait a second to see if he comes back. Let's move on to Jason, and then we'll circle back to Kenny.
Sure. So I would just say, just being a teacher, that I think that one very effective way of combating meat industry disinformation is through schools, by introducing curricula for cultivating and developing a kind of information literacy. I think that schools can be a very good place for this. I mean, we teach students, economic literacy and political literacy. I think we should be teaching media literacy, and I think we should also be teaching a kind of agricultural literacy as well. So, and students are very receptive to this kind of messaging. They're receptive to this kind of content. And so we have some, critical animal studies, courses that are, gaining traction in universities across North America and Europe. But I think we should, kind of push for generalizing these courses and making them more basic and standard, so that students get this very valuable information and these tools for seeing through and critiquing and analyzing industry media BS.
Thank you, Jason. And Kenny's back. That's great, Kenny. So I just want to give you an opportunity to finish off with what you were saying.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, my internet is a little weak at this moment, so I've turned my video off just for a moment. But I was just going to say that I think another issue that I've really kind of come across over the last few months is that a lot of the leading U.S. environmental groups in the United States have really avoided talking about this issue, which is partly a problem. But I think another problem is that kind of what Jason was referencing earlier, that regenerative agriculture has been proposed as really the primary solution to reducing livestock emissions and agricultural emissions writ large. And some aspects of regenerative agriculture certainly should be implemented and can restore ecological health to different landscapes. But I've seen the broader environmental community often exaggerate the potential of regenerative agriculture to reduce livestock emissions. And I think in many ways that muddies the water and muddies the debate on what we really need to do, which is just reduce the number of animals we raise and consume for food.
Thank you, Kenny. Now I want to go back to Tushar because I did forget his question. I apologize. Tushar, what role does disinformation play in shaping dietary choices and nutritional beliefs? And how might this influence the prevalence of diet-related diseases and health outcomes within communities?
Well, I think there's a number of ways in which this has happened, and I'll just provide a few examples. Just related to policy and systemic things, we see, for example, there are egg, dairy, meat industry involved in nutrition guidelines in multiple different countries, right? And so disinvolvement really skews the guidelines and becomes a source of anti-science problems. And Canada's recent food guide was the first one that completely excluded any kind of industry involvement, but that could change with the next food guide as well. And it gets us back to the topic of, when do we need to exclude industry from educational materials and education systems itself? So in schools, there are school lunch programs and all kinds of things in Canada, in the US, and other countries that manifest differently in different countries, but the industry involvement in those places, not just the meat industry, but also, sugar industries and things like that, junk food industries, have a role to play, play a role in getting their products included, right? And that's another systemic thing. The industry funds or connects with universities and has many programs that are funded by industry and then are going to be very biased. Again, this applies to multiple industries, not just the animal agriculture industry. They fund associations. So in the Canadian Diabetic Association, or I don't want to necessarily quote them, let me leave them out of it, but let's pick, just say generic some associations. You'll see funding and activity and involvement of animal agriculture industries and their associated academics in those institutions themselves. So, tracking all this stuff is a lot of work. What I was going to also just, continue on what, Jennifer was saying, and also, Jason and Kenny, is that, I really believe that the analysis of disinformation has to become a big, major, a major academic pursuit in and of itself, which then trickles from big academic, universities and institutions where they're going to be very, very critical about this. And from there, go to curriculum in public schools. Because I think if you had like a program in a school that said, okay, let's fight disinformation, within a couple of years, you're going to have the meat industry and all these other industries, fossil fuel industry, whoever, also creating similar programs to fight disinformation and put their curriculum into the school, just like they have net zero programs, et cetera. They're going to have a Let's Fight Disinformation program that looks beautiful. They can create a beautiful thing on paper, just like regenerative grazing. The narratives they create are beautiful, but they're not scientific when you dig down. And so having these things in schools, but excluding industry influence from them, is going to be very important at the same time. And I just like to say, people like Jennifer and what Jason and Kenny are doing. You guys are are really trailblazers, and in terms of doing these things within media and within within academics as well.
Thank you, Tushar. I think one of the problems is it's so expensive to get those programs, and the meat industry is so well funded that our side needs to find ways of gaining the money to do proper advertising and lobbying and lots of other
The
things.
CFRP is also a trailblazer in this respect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we couldn't do it without you guys. Anyway, I wanted to thank this panelist. These were great. Your answers were enlightened and insightful. And so thank you very much. I want to turn now it over to Howard, who's going to be taking some of the questions the attendees, you guys have put into the chat. So Howard, if you just want to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for your questions so far. I think we've got some really, really great ones. So I just want to start here with a question, I think maybe kind of primarily perhaps to Kenny, but also Jennifer, Jason could have thoughts. Anyone else on the panel too, of course. So is the media sufficiently incentivized to fight disinformation? And I think that could apply to maybe disinformation in general, but maybe especially, is the media sufficiently incentivized to fight misinformation about animal agriculture? So I don't know. Oh, Kenny, I think you're. Oh.
This is a great question. And sorry, I'm just going to leave my. Oh, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. If it goes out, just let me know in the chat, and I will just call in. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable, but unfortunately, I think the media industry is not adequately incentivized to address this issue, to combat disinformation on animal agriculture, just because the effects of animal agriculture is not a priority for the industry to cover. I mean, again, I think it ought to be, otherwise I wouldn't be on this panel, but I think it touches so many parts of our lives and of society, not just animals, but, you know, water quality, air quality, climate change, labor, you name it. It's a very far-reaching issue. And so I think it's neglected on multiple facets, not just the environmental angle. And so, I mean, I think internally at Vox, I can say that there's a lot of people over the years, both, you know, in leadership and the rank and file, who see this as an important issue worth covering and have invested in it. But I think we're an exception to the rule. I hope we can set an example and show people that when this issue is written about in an engaging way, it can really attract an audience. But I think ultimately it's going to take people like the leadership within a news organization who, you know, puts their foot down and says, this is an important issue worth covering, in order for it to really be taken on. But otherwise, it's often an afterthought.
If I may, one of the great difficulties of our time, I believe, is that things are increasingly, the world is increasingly corporatized. Not that all companies or corporations are bad or anything like that, but it is dominated now by these as a major power. And when it comes to large industries, fossil fuels, banking, animal agriculture, like the media, large media complex is basically funded by the people who pay for media. So if animal agriculture or fossil fuels are paying literally hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising to media, then the media industries are going to have a bias towards the clients who are paying them, as opposed to people who are not going to be paying them, right? And therefore there's these biases in the media industry itself. And you know, people like, I think, Vox and Kenny and some of the people, the great media outlets you mentioned, are sort of minority voices compared to the mainstream as a result of this, which even when they do criticize or bring these things up, they do so in a very, very superficial way, and often in ways that leave out such major aspects and include the voice of the animal agriculture industry, which is very polished, to say their point of view, whatever it might be, and you end up getting nowhere, really. And so there's these large biases in media, just structurally, that are there. And how can you get to a world where we can distill that is going to be a major challenge that we have to work on.
No, thanks so much. There's so many great questions and there's so little time. I think we'll probably have to do something like get back to folks, or do, you know, ideally do some sort of follow-up where we address a lot of these. So thanks everyone, and, you know, for the questions so far. And if you have more, keep them coming and we'll try to get back to folks, but I think we may only have time for a couple more here. One that I definitely wanted to make sure gets asked is, I'm a current University of Alberta agriculture student, and I find it disturbing that this topic is not raised or addressed in any classes that are part of my degree. It's also quite apparent that the basic animal agriculture and other agriculture classes offered are influenced by the various animal agriculture boards. Any practices or welfare issues brought forward are met with skepticism, and anyone who questions the animal agriculture practices is labeled an animal rights nut. How do we get this subject or topic into university courses so more students and citizens are aware of these problems and tactics? So
I'm probably suited to answer that because I've been doing a lot of work on universities, and I'm also embedded in a marine atmospheric and earth sciences school, which has a very large fisheries arm, and fisheries look a lot like terrestrial animal ag, in the sense that the field itself is not independent from industry, the way that climate science was actually independent from the fossil fuel industry. And that actually is part of the strength of the credibility and reliability of that information. And so what I have been seeing for both animal ag and fisheries alike is that the best way to fight sort of disinformation and bias, which I think Tushar was talking about the bias of the media, and then Kenny was talking more explicitly about disinformation. But for both of those things has been to take that conversation away from those fields, which is very difficult to do, but is happening through animal law courses, through classes in the humanities, classes in environmental studies or environmental policy that are interested. I'm teaching a class called Food, Animals, and Environmental Policy, where they aren't as embedded within those structures that are ultimately tied to industry. And so unfortunately, if that student is a graduate student, I've really seen their power heavily constrained, but undergraduates who are seen more as typical consumers can have a lot of power. Sort of ironically, that undergrads, I think, have more power within the institution to some extent than graduate students do in bringing these curricular matters to light. Thanks.
No, that's fascinating. Thanks so much. That seems like really, really interesting. And important. And yeah, and I think the analogies between where fossil fuels are and where animal ag is, those are really helpful to know about. So there's sort of three questions that kind of cluster around what can we do that I have so far. So I'll just ask them kind of all, and maybe people can speak to different parts of them. So the first is, what is our role as individuals to affect the production and companies' action for more sustainability? The next is, how do we pressure the government to follow its own science and operationalize the Canada Food Guide by subsidizing agriculture accordingly? And then finally, as a Canadian citizen, how can I best argue against the regenerative and sustainability claims of the animal agriculture industry? So I guess there's kind of, what can individuals do and how do they argue, but also how do we push for more institutional reforms? So anyone, who wants to take parts of that? You can take any part that you find helpful.
I guess I'll jump in here and say that I think in battling disinformation, the first step is simply just talking about it, and talking about it can happen on multiple levels. It can happen on talking to peers and friends and family. It can happen by talking to policymakers and institutions like academia or media or in the corporate space. But I think the kind of whole broader like animal welfare movement, environmental movement is kind of up against some strong tides, in that the industry is heavily incentivized to maintain the status quo. And but I think the Letitia James, the New York State Attorney General's lawsuit against JBS, simply just holding them to change how they talk about their practices. And that's kind of what we're really talking about here. This is really just step one, looking for honesty and accuracy. Actually getting companies to change their practices or diversify their food offerings is a whole other ballgame. But I think ultimately, when industry is challenged on this issue, their response usually speaks volumes. I'll just say real quick, as an example, when Tyson Foods, I think about 6 months ago, started advertising for its quote unquote climate friendly beef. When I asked both Tyson and the USDA, can you share data on this? Tyson refused to talk to me about it. They refused to share any data. And then the USDA said that I would have to file a Freedom of Information Act request to just get basic data on how they approved this label. So I think by simply just reaching out and asking questions, or in the case of the New York State Attorney General, really taking task on their claims, goes a long way, because often these claims
I think we're maybe
Karen,
Yeah, thank you, Kenny.
Claims, aren't defensible.
Yeah, no, thanks.
And don't hold up.
Thanks so much, Kenny. Yeah, no, we really appreciate that. So do others have thoughts on the broad question of like what should we do? Jason, yeah. Oh, Jason, you're muted. Jason, can you unmute?
Yeah. So very quickly, just about pushing back against the regenerative ag talking point and myth and theme and trope. I think that it's a good idea to question the claim that they make that livestock farming is a natural part of the ecosystem, that it's necessary to have a healthy environment and so forth. I think it's important to push back against that by asking some basic questions. If they say that this is a natural part of the environment and so forth, to first of all ask them where these animals came from, because cows and pigs are not native to the Americas. These animals were brought here by colonizers, and then used to take over large swaths of land through what Alfred Crosby has called ecological imperialism. And then they do take a lot of pride in being fourth generation farmers or fifth generation ranchers or whatever. I think we should then ask them, well, how did the first generation acquire the land? Because it's not like First Nations just kind of packed up and left and said, "Here, please take our land." These lands were, appropriated through extreme colonial violence, and animal farming has been a driver of colonial expansion in the Americas for hundreds of years. So I think that kind of decolonial and anti-colonial story should be part of this pushback against the kind of feel-good salvation narrative of regenerative ag. And I don't think we should have any qualms about being aggressive in it either.
I'm just going to really say quickly that at Plant-Based Data, one of our specialties is discussing the problem of this concept of regenerative grazing. And so please do go to our website, and you'll see a lot of papers that are there that address the topic, scientific papers, or research papers, as well as videos by our team. And in the coming months, you're going to see a very large document that's well referenced and goes through the entire critique in a very step-by-step technical way about regenerative grazing, because you can get into sort of these different debates, but I think ultimately it's going to be a very technical thing to contradict this narrative, and it's and it can be contradicted very well that way.
Thank you, Tushar. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions, but what we'll do is try to get back to you with the answers to some of the questions we missed in the chat. I wanted to say that we have, hopefully it's in the chat, the link to one of our special friends, Nicholas Carter. He has just published on the Freedom Food Alliance website a huge document that's a fantastic assessment of disinformation in the animal agriculture industry from soup to nuts in terms of looking at it, the issue. It's called Harvesting Denial, Distractions and Deception, Understanding Animal Agriculture's Disinformation Strategies and Exploring Solutions. I highly recommend you looking at that. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. It was just such a great panel, and thank you, panelists. You've been amazing. What I want to do is thank the University of Alberta and Canadians for Responsible Food Policy for hosting this panel, and I welcome you all to stay informed about the issue. Thank you for attending. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Karen and Howard.
Thank you so much, everyone. Nice to meet you all too.
Everyone, take care.
Yeah,
Take care. Lovely to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.